Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to The English Globe, where we explore important global topics through clear, calm, and learner-friendly English. And today, I would like to invite you into a discussion that may surprise you at first, because when people hear the name Donald Trump, they often think about strong speeches, bold statements, and confrontational politics. Yet at the same time, they also hear headlines that describe him as a dealmaker, a negotiator, or even someone involved in peace efforts, which creates a powerful sense of curiosity and confusion that makes many English learners ask an important question. How can one political figure be associated with both tension and diplomacy? And what does this tell us about the way modern international relations really work behind the scenes?
This confusion is completely understandable, especially for learners who follow international news in English, because headlines are often short, emotional, and sometimes dramatic, which means they do not always explain the full story or the deeper reasons behind political actions. So when learners see words like peace talks, negotiations, or diplomatic outreach connected to Donald Trump, they may wonder whether this is a change in strategy, a media misunderstanding, or simply a different style of diplomacy that does not fit traditional expectations. And that is why careful listening and slow explanation are so important when we discuss global topics in an educational way.
The central idea of today's episode is not to praise or criticize any political leader, but to understand how diplomacy can take many different forms, because traditional diplomacy often happens quietly through professional diplomats, long meetings, formal language, and detailed agreements, while Trump's approach, according to many observers, appears more direct, personal, and sometimes public, which can feel unusual or even uncomfortable for people who are used to a more formal diplomatic style. Yet this difference does not automatically mean the absence of diplomacy, but rather a different method of communication and negotiation that deserves to be examined calmly and clearly.
For English learners, this topic is especially valuable because it teaches us how the same action can be described in very different ways depending on language choice, tone, and context, as one headline may describe a meeting as a peace effort, another may call it a strategic move, and a third may focus on political pressure. So learning to listen for main ideas instead of emotional words helps learners build a more balanced understanding while also improving their ability to follow complex news stories without feeling overwhelmed or confused by strong vocabulary.
When we talk about peace efforts in modern politics, it is important to remember that peace does not always begin with friendly language or traditional ceremonies, because in many cases, it starts with negotiation, pressure, and strategic communication, which can look very different from one leader to another. And this is why Trump's diplomatic actions often create debate, as some people see them as attempts to reduce conflict through direct talks, while others view them as risky or unconventional. And our role in this episode is simply to explain these perspectives in simple English so learners can understand the topic without being pushed toward any opinion.
Another reason this topic attracts so much attention is that global peace efforts today are closely connected to domestic politics, media messaging, and public image, meaning that what leaders say to their own citizens can influence how their actions are interpreted internationally. So learners who study English through global news should always ask gentle questions such as, who is speaking, who is listening, and what message is being sent? Because these questions help improve both language skills and critical thinking at the same time, which is one of the main goals of educational listening content like this podcast.
As we move forward in this episode, you will hear us use clear question-based sentences, such as, why does this approach seem different? How do peace efforts actually work? And what can learners understand from these events? Because questions are powerful tools in English learning, helping listeners stay focused, organize information, and follow long explanations more easily, especially when the topic involves international relations, diplomacy, and political communication that may feel complex at first, but becomes clearer when explained step by step.
We also encourage you as listeners to pay attention not only to what is said, but how it is said. Because tone, word choice, and structure matter greatly in political English. And by listening carefully, you can improve your ability to understand interviews, speeches, and news reports, while slowly building confidence in following long discussions without translating every word in your head, which is an important skill for reaching higher levels of English fluency and comprehension.
Before we continue deeper into the topic, we gently invite you to support the English Globe by liking this episode, subscribing to the channel, and turning on notifications, because your support allows us to continue producing long, structured, and educational content that focuses on global issues explained in simple English, without sensational language or unnecessary complexity, and helps us reach learners around the world who want to improve their listening skills while understanding how international politics and diplomacy shape the modern world.
We would also love to hear from you in the comments, especially about where you are listening from, because our community includes learners from many different countries and cultures, and sharing your location helps create a sense of global connection while reminding us that diplomacy, peace, and international communication affect people everywhere, not just governments or politicians, and your presence here shows that learning English can be a bridge between cultures and perspectives.
As we begin this educational journey together, remember that this podcast is designed to explore ideas, explain language, and encourage understanding, not to tell you what to think, because our main purpose is to help you become a more confident English listener who can follow international discussions calmly, understand different viewpoints, and recognize that in global politics, peace efforts can appear in many forms, sometimes traditional and quiet, and sometimes unexpected and highly visible, which makes careful listening and open-minded learning more important than ever.
So take a deep breath, relax, and prepare to listen closely, because in the next parts of this episode, we will slowly unpack Donald Trump's diplomatic style, explain why it attracts so much attention, and help you learn useful vocabulary and sentence structures along the way, ensuring that even complex global topics become accessible, meaningful, and engaging for English learners who want to understand the world more clearly through language.
To understand Donald Trump's diplomatic style clearly, it is helpful to begin with his professional background, because before entering politics, he spent many years as a businessman, developer, and negotiator, and this experience strongly influenced how he views international relations. Since he often approaches countries in the same way a business person approaches companies, focusing on interests, leverage, costs, benefits, and outcomes, rather than long historical traditions or formal diplomatic language, which means that when Trump speaks about diplomacy, he often uses words like deal, win, loss, and fairness, vocabulary that reflects a business mindset more than a traditional political one.
In simple English, this means that Trump tends to see international relationships as transactions, where each side gives something and receives something in return. So for English learners, it is useful to notice how this cause and effect thinking appears in his language. Because when he believes a country is benefiting more than the United States, he often argues that the agreement should be changed, renegotiated, or replaced, which helps learners understand why he often talks about better deals or stronger positions instead of long-term cooperation or shared values, terms that are more common in classical diplomacy.
Traditional diplomacy usually works through experienced diplomats, long negotiations, careful wording, and multilateral institutions where many countries participate together, but Trump's style often prefers direct communication between leaders, because he believes that personal relationships can speed up negotiations and reduce misunderstandings. So instead of relying heavily on diplomats behind closed doors, he often emphasizes meetings, phone calls, and public statements between presidents or prime ministers, which creates a very visible form of diplomacy that people around the world can easily follow through news media.
For learners, this difference is important to understand because traditional diplomacy may feel slow and invisible, while Trump's approach feels fast and public. And this contrast explains why his actions often receive strong reactions, as some people see direct talks as efficient and honest, while others worry that they reduce the role of experts and institutions. So when you hear phrases like leader-to-leader talks or personal diplomacy, you can now connect them to this preference for direct interaction instead of formal diplomatic processes.
Another key feature of Trump's diplomatic style is his comfort with pressure as a negotiating tool. Because in business negotiations, pressure is often used to gain advantage, and Trump applies a similar logic to international relations by using economic measures, political signals, or strong language to influence the behavior of other countries while still leaving space for negotiation, which means that pressure and diplomacy are not separate in his approach, but part of the same strategy aimed at reaching an agreement that he considers favorable.
In learner-friendly terms, we can say that Trump often believes pressure leads to talks, and talks lead to deals, which is a clear cause and effect structure that helps English learners practice explanation language, because you can use sentences like because pressure increases urgency, negotiations begin faster, or as a result of direct communication, agreements may happen more quickly. And these sentence patterns are very useful, not only for understanding politics, but also for improving your overall English writing and speaking skills.
It is also important to note that Trump's diplomatic style often challenges established norms, meaning the unwritten rules about how leaders usually speak and behave on the global stage, because he sometimes chooses informal language, unexpected statements, or unconventional meeting formats, which can make his diplomacy appear unpredictable, yet unpredictability itself can be a strategy, as it may force other countries to pay closer attention and prepare for multiple outcomes, something that is common in competitive negotiation environments.
For English learners, this teaches an important lesson about tone and style, because language is not only about grammar and vocabulary, but also about how messages are delivered. So when Trump uses simple, strong sentences instead of complex diplomatic language, it becomes easier for global audiences to understand his message, even if they disagree with it. And this shows learners that clear and direct English can be powerful, especially in public communication.
When comparing Trump's approach to traditional diplomacy, we can say that traditional diplomacy values stability, continuity, and careful consensus building, while Trump's style values speed, leverage, and visible results. And this difference explains why his peace efforts often look unusual, as they may begin with strong pressure or public disagreement before moving toward negotiation, which can confuse observers who expect peace efforts to start with polite dialogue and mutual trust.
To make this clearer, learners can think of two different problem-solving styles, where one style focuses on long discussions and gradual compromise, and the other focuses on strong opening positions followed by negotiation, and neither style is automatically right or wrong. But understanding these differences helps learners read international news more accurately and avoid simple conclusions based only on headlines.
Another useful vocabulary point here is the word diplomacy itself, which in simple terms means the way countries communicate, negotiate, and manage relationships without using force, and Trump's version of diplomacy still fits within this definition, even if it looks different, because it aims to influence outcomes through talks, agreements, and strategic communication rather than direct conflict. And recognizing this helps learners see that diplomacy is a broad concept with many possible forms.
As listeners, you can practice explanation language by summarizing this idea in your own words. Using structures like Trump's diplomatic style is influenced by his business background, which leads him to prefer direct talks and deal-making. Because sentences like this combine cause, effect, and clear explanation, which are essential skills for advanced English listening and speaking.
As we continue this episode, keep in mind that understanding a leader's style does not require agreement or disagreement, but careful observation and clear language analysis, because our goal is to help you understand how different diplomatic approaches work, why they create different reactions, and how English is used to describe these complex processes in news reports, speeches, and global discussions.
By listening closely to these explanations and noticing the sentence structures we use, you are not only learning about diplomacy, but also training your ear to follow long explanations, recognize cause and effect relationships, and build confidence in understanding serious global topics through English, which is exactly the kind of progress the English Globe aims to support in every episode.
To understand the idea of peace through deals, we need to slow down and examine a key belief that often appears in Donald Trump's approach to international relations, which is the idea that strong pressure can create the conditions for negotiation, because from his perspective, pressure does not always mean aggression, but rather leverage. And leverage is the ability to influence another side's decisions by controlling important economic, political, or strategic factors, which he believes can push countries toward the negotiating table instead of allowing conflicts to remain frozen or ignored for long periods of time.
In simpler words, this means Trump often sees pressure as a way to start conversations rather than to end them. So for English learners, it is helpful to think of pressure as a signal that says change is needed. Because when one side feels economic or political discomfort, it may become more willing to talk, negotiate, and search for compromise. And this explanation helps learners understand why pressure and peace are sometimes connected in political discussions, even though they may sound like opposite ideas at first.
One of the main tools connected to this strategy is the use of sanctions, which are economic restrictions placed on a country to limit its access to money, trade, or international systems. And Trump has often supported sanctions as a way to send a strong message without using military force, because sanctions apply pressure while still leaving space for dialogue, negotiations, and eventual agreements, making them a central part of what he considers a deal-based approach to peace, rather than a path toward immediate conflict.
For learners, it is useful to remember that sanctions are not weapons, but policies, meaning they are decisions made through laws and agreements. And this distinction is very important for understanding global news, because when reports talk about sanctions, they are describing political and economic pressure, not direct fighting, which helps learners separate peaceful pressure from violent conflict and improves their ability to follow international discussions calmly and clearly.
Another related tool is tariffs, which are taxes placed on imported goods, and in Trump's thinking, tariffs can be used as leverage to change behavior, encourage negotiations, or push countries to agree to new trade terms, because higher costs can motivate governments and businesses to seek compromise. And while tariffs are often discussed in economic contexts, they also play a role in diplomatic strategy when leaders use economic influence to shape international relationships without turning to military action.
In simple language, tariffs make things more expensive, and when things become more expensive, people look for solutions. So this cause and effect relationship helps learners understand why economic tools are often connected to diplomacy, because governments use them to influence decisions while avoiding direct confrontation. And recognizing this pattern allows learners to better understand phrases like economic pressure, negotiation leverage, and trade-based diplomacy when they appear in news reports.
Political pressure is another important part of this strategy, and it can include strong public statements, diplomatic isolation, or signaling dissatisfaction through international forums. Because Trump often believes that making positions clear and public reduces confusion and forces other leaders to respond, which contrasts with quieter diplomatic methods that rely on private discussions and gradual trust building. And this difference explains why his peace efforts often begin with tension before moving toward dialogue.
For English learners, this shows how abstract ideas like pressure and leverage can be understood through everyday examples, because leverage simply means having something that influences another person's choices, and in politics that influence may come from money, trade, reputation, or alliances. So when learners connect these abstract words to real-world situations, they become easier to understand and remember.
It is very important to clearly separate pressure from military conflict, because while both involve power, they are not the same, as military conflict involves physical force, weapons, and direct harm, while pressure-based diplomacy operates through policies, negotiations, and communication. And Trump has often argued that using economic or political pressure is a way to avoid war rather than start it, because it allows countries to change behavior without immediate violence, even though it can still create serious tension.
This distinction is especially helpful for learners who may feel overwhelmed by international news, because understanding that not all conflict leads to war allows listeners to follow global events with less fear and more clarity. And it also helps them learn how journalists and analysts carefully choose words to describe situations using terms like escalation, de-escalation, talks, or negotiations to signal different stages of international tension.
From a logical point of view, the strategy of peace through deals follows a clear structure. Apply pressure to highlight a problem, open communication to discuss solutions, and negotiate an agreement that reduces conflict. And while this approach is debated and interpreted differently by various observers, our role here is not to judge its success or failure, but to explain how this logic works and why it appears frequently in discussions about Trump's diplomatic efforts.
Learners can practice clarifying complex ideas by using sentences like the goal of pressure is not conflict, but negotiation, or economic tools are used to influence behavior without military action, because these structures help simplify abstract political concepts and improve the ability to explain difficult topics in clear and confident English.
As we move forward in this episode, keep listening for how words like pressure, leverage, negotiation, and agreement are connected, because these words form the core vocabulary of deal-based diplomacy, and understanding them will help you follow future sections more easily, while also strengthening your listening skills for news, podcasts, and discussions about international relations.
By taking time to understand these ideas slowly and calmly, you are not only learning about one political strategy, but also building the language tools needed to understand many global issues. Because peace, conflict, and negotiation are central themes in international news, and learning how they are explained in simple English will support your growth as a confident and informed English listener.
When we talk about high-profile diplomatic engagements, we are referring to meetings and interactions that receive strong international attention because they involve well-known leaders and visible moments of communication. And during Donald Trump's time on the global stage, many of his diplomatic efforts took this very public form, including face-to-face meetings, official visits, and highly reported summits, which are important to understand not because of personal opinions, but because they show how modern diplomacy is often communicated through images, headlines, and carefully described events in international news.
For English learners, these moments can feel confusing or even overwhelming, because a single photograph or short video clip can carry many meanings depending on how it is explained. So it is helpful to remember that high-profile meetings are often designed to send messages, not only to the leaders involved, but also to the public, the media, and other governments around the world. Which is why learning how to describe these events clearly in English is an important skill for understanding global news.
One noticeable feature of Trump's diplomatic approach was his preference for direct leader-to-leader meetings, where presidents or prime ministers speak personally rather than relying only on diplomats or written communication. And these meetings are often described in news reports using phrases such as historic talks, direct engagement, or face-to-face discussions, which signal that something unusual or significant is taking place, even if no immediate agreement is announced at the end of the meeting.
In simple terms, direct talks matter because they allow leaders to communicate without intermediaries, which means messages can be delivered more quickly and clearly. And for learners, this helps explain why journalists often focus on who met whom, where the meeting happened, and how long it lasted. Because these details suggest the level of seriousness and intention behind the diplomatic engagement, even when the actual conversation remains private.
Another important element in these engagements is symbolism, which refers to the meaning created by actions, locations, gestures, and timing rather than spoken words. And in diplomacy, symbolism can be very powerful because a handshake, a shared stage, or a visit to a specific place can suggest openness, recognition, or a willingness to talk. And Trump's meetings were often rich in symbolic elements that media outlets carefully described and analyzed.
For example, when leaders stand together in front of national flags or walk side by side in public spaces, these images can influence how audiences around the world interpret the relationship, because visuals often communicate emotions and intentions faster than long explanations, and this is why English learners should pay attention not only to spoken statements, but also to how news reports describe images using words like symbolic, historic, carefully staged, or widely watched.
News English often uses neutral and descriptive language to report these engagements, focusing on facts such as dates, locations, participants, and stated goals. So you may hear sentences like the leaders held talks aimed at reducing tensions, or the meeting was seen as a signal of renewed dialogue, and these expressions are useful for learners because they show how journalists report events without making strong judgments or emotional claims.
By noticing this neutral tone, learners can improve their own English by practicing descriptive language that explains what happened rather than what should have happened, which is an important skill not only for understanding news, but also for writing summaries, reports, or academic assignments where objectivity and clarity are required.
High-profile engagements also demonstrate how diplomacy today is closely connected to public communication, because leaders are aware that their meetings will be broadcast, shared, and discussed globally, which means that diplomatic actions often serve two purposes at the same time: communicating with another government and communicating with a global audience, and understanding this dual purpose helps learners see why these events are carefully planned and widely covered.
From a learning perspective, this shows why images and meetings can strongly affect global perception, because people often remember visual moments more easily than long policy documents. So a single meeting can change how a relationship is viewed, at least temporarily, and this helps learners understand why media reports often return to the same images when discussing diplomatic relations.
As we continue our discussion, keep listening for descriptive phrases and reporting verbs such as said, stated, announced, signaled, and emphasized, because these words are commonly used in news English to describe diplomatic engagements accurately and neutrally, and learning to recognize them will help you follow international news with greater confidence and understanding.
By focusing on how these high-profile engagements are described rather than how they are judged, you can strengthen your ability to understand global events through English, improve your descriptive language skills, and develop a calmer, more analytical approach to international news, which is exactly what we aim to support here on the English Globe.
To understand why peace efforts are communicated in certain ways, it is important to look inside a country and examine domestic politics, because foreign policy is not created in isolation, but is strongly influenced by voters, political institutions, media, and public expectations, which means that when leaders talk about peace, negotiations, or diplomacy, they are often speaking not only to other countries, but also to their own citizens, who want to feel secure, respected, and confident about their nation's position in the world.
For English learners, this explains why political speeches sometimes sound emotional or dramatic, because leaders use language to reassure domestic audiences, show control, and build trust. So when you hear phrases like protecting national interests or standing strong while seeking peace, these expressions are designed to send multiple messages at the same time. And understanding this helps learners recognize that tone and intention are just as important as the actual words being spoken.
Peace efforts matter to domestic audiences because voters often care deeply about safety, economic stability, and international reputation. And leaders know that presenting themselves as capable of avoiding war while defending national interests can strengthen public support, which is why peace messaging often highlights ideas such as strength, fairness, and responsibility, even when the goal is negotiation rather than confrontation, and this balance between calm reassurance and firm language is a key feature of political communication.
In simpler terms, leaders try to say, we are strong enough to protect ourselves, but wise enough to choose peace. And for learners, this sentence structure is very useful, because it shows how contrast words like but and while help communicate two ideas at once, which is common in political English, and helps listeners understand that strength and peace are not always presented as opposites.
Another important distinction to understand is the difference between political messaging and real negotiations, because political messaging is what leaders say publicly through speeches, interviews, and social media, while negotiations often happen privately through diplomats, advisors, and official channels, and Trump's communication style often made this contrast very visible, as his public statements sometimes sounded tough or confrontational, while negotiations continued behind the scenes at the same time.
For English learners, this means it is important not to take every public statement as a direct description of what is happening in negotiations, because public language is often shaped by domestic political needs, media attention, and timing, so learning to separate message from action helps listeners interpret news more carefully and avoid misunderstanding the real direction of diplomatic efforts.
Political vocabulary plays a big role here, with words like national interest, public opinion, political base, and leadership image appearing frequently in discussions about peace messaging, and understanding these terms allows learners to follow why leaders choose certain words and tones, because these choices are rarely accidental and are often designed to connect with specific groups within the country.
To make this easier, learners can listen for clues in tone and structure, such as whether a speech emphasizes unity, strength, or caution, because these signals reveal the speaker's intention. And by practicing this skill, learners improve their ability to interpret intent, which means understanding what the speaker wants the audience to feel or believe, not just what the speaker is saying on the surface.
Another interesting aspect is how leaders communicate strength and peace at the same time, because they often use firm language about defense and readiness while also expressing openness to dialogue, and this dual message helps maintain credibility both at home and abroad, showing domestic audiences that their leader is not weak, while signaling to other countries that negotiation is still possible.
For learners, this dual communication can be understood through sentence patterns, like while maintaining security, the government remains open to talks, which clearly shows two intentions in one statement. And practicing these structures can help learners improve their own ability to explain complex political ideas in balanced and neutral English.
Media coverage plays a strong role in shaping how domestic audiences receive peace messaging, because journalists select quotes, headlines, and images that influence public perception, which means that the same diplomatic effort can appear either strong or risky depending on how it is presented. And understanding this interaction between politics and media helps learners become more careful readers and listeners of international news.
By paying attention to how language is used to balance reassurance and authority, learners can develop a deeper understanding of political communication, recognizing that speeches are often carefully designed to meet domestic expectations while supporting diplomatic goals, and this awareness supports both language development and critical thinking.
As we continue this episode, remember that domestic politics and peace messaging are closely connected, because leaders must constantly manage internal expectations while engaging with the outside world. And by learning the vocabulary, tone, and structure of this communication, you will be better prepared to understand international news in English without confusion or emotional reaction.
Through careful listening and practice, you are building the ability to interpret intent, understand political language, and follow complex discussions with confidence, which is an important step in becoming a strong English listener who can engage thoughtfully with global topics, exactly as we aim to support here on the English Globe.
When we examine international reactions to diplomatic efforts, it is important to remember that countries respond based on their own interests, histories, and relationships, which means that the same action can receive support from some nations, skepticism from others, and silence from many. Not because one reaction is correct and another is wrong, but because global politics is shaped by different priorities, experiences, and expectations, and understanding this diversity of responses helps English learners see international relations as a complex system rather than a simple story with one clear interpretation.
For learners, this explains why news reports often include a wide range of voices, because journalists aim to show how different governments view the same event, and by comparing these perspectives, listeners can develop a more balanced understanding, noticing that reactions are not emotional opinions, but responses shaped by political position, economic interests, and regional concerns, which makes comparison an essential skill in understanding global news.
Some countries express support for diplomatic efforts because they see potential benefits such as reduced tension, economic stability, or improved regional security. And these supportive reactions are often described in careful language like welcomed the talks or expressed hope for progress, which signals approval without strong commitment, and this neutral wording is common in diplomatic statements where governments want to remain flexible while showing a positive attitude.
In comparison, other nations respond with skepticism, using cautious language that reflects uncertainty or concern, such as raised questions, called for clarity, or expressed reservations. And for learners, it is helpful to notice how this language avoids direct criticism while still signaling doubt, which shows how diplomacy often uses indirect expression to maintain relationships even when opinions differ.
Silence is another important response that appears frequently in international relations, and it can be just as meaningful as open support or skepticism, because when a country chooses not to comment publicly, it may be waiting for more information, avoiding escalation, or protecting its strategic interests. And understanding this helps learners realize that absence of reaction does not mean absence of opinion, but rather a deliberate communication choice.
By comparing support, skepticism, and silence, learners can practice comparative language using structures like some countries responded positively, while others remained cautious, which helps build clearer explanations and improves the ability to describe differences objectively without adding personal judgment.
Allies and rivals often respond differently because their relationships with the United States are shaped by trust, shared goals, or competition. So allies may focus on stability and coordination, while rivals may emphasize caution or alternative interpretations. And this difference explains why the same diplomatic move can be framed as progress in one region and as uncertainty in another, depending on historical ties and strategic interests.
For English learners, this comparison teaches an important lesson about opinion versus fact, because facts describe what happened, such as a meeting took place or a statement was released, while opinions describe how events are interpreted, such as the talks were seen as promising or the strategy was viewed with concern. And separating these two types of language helps learners follow news more accurately.
Diplomacy is also interpreted differently across cultures because communication styles, political traditions, and media environments vary widely, meaning that what appears direct and strong in one culture may appear unusual or risky in another, and understanding this cultural dimension helps learners see why global reactions are often mixed and why international communication requires careful wording and patience.
Learners can strengthen their listening skills by asking gentle questions such as who is reacting, what language is being used, and is this a fact or an interpretation? Because these questions encourage critical thinking and help prevent misunderstanding when listening to complex international discussions in English.
News English often reflects this global diversity by presenting reactions side by side, using phrases like according to officials, in contrast, or meanwhile, which signal comparison and shift between perspectives, and learning to recognize these signals allows learners to follow longer reports more easily and understand how journalists organize information.
By practicing comparison, learners also build confidence in expressing balanced views, because they can describe differences without choosing sides, using neutral language that focuses on understanding rather than judgment, which is a valuable skill not only in English learning but also in academic and professional communication.
As we continue this episode, keep in mind that international reactions are shaped by many factors, including history, geography, economics, and security concerns. And by listening carefully to how these reactions are described, you can improve your ability to understand global diplomacy through English in a calm and informed way.
Through this process of comparison and careful listening, you are learning to separate facts from interpretations, recognize different perspectives, and engage more confidently with international news, which is exactly the kind of language growth and global awareness we aim to support here on the English Globe.
When we talk about media coverage in international politics, it is very important to understand that the media does not only report events, but also frames them, which means it selects certain words, angles, and details that shape how audiences understand what is happening, and this is especially true in political news, where complex diplomatic actions are often reduced to short headlines that must attract attention quickly, even if they cannot fully explain the background, intentions, or consequences of the event.
For English learners, this can be challenging because headlines are usually written in compressed and dramatic language using strong verbs and emotional words. So learners may feel confused or worried when they read a headline without context, which is why it is essential to learn how to slow down, read beyond the headline, and listen for deeper explanations in longer reports, interviews, or educational content like this podcast.
Headlines and detailed analysis serve very different purposes, because a headline aims to catch the reader's eye in just a few seconds, while detailed analysis aims to explain what happened, why it happened, and what it may mean in the future. So when you see a headline that sounds dramatic, it does not necessarily mean the situation is dramatic, but rather that the language is designed to compete for attention in a fast-moving media environment.
A helpful listening tip for learners is to treat headlines as signals, not full stories, meaning they tell you what topic is being discussed, but not the full meaning. So after reading a headline, it is useful to ask simple questions like what exactly happened, who is involved, and what details are missing, because these questions guide you toward deeper understanding and prevent misunderstanding.
Another key difference in media coverage is the use of emotional language versus neutral language, because emotional language is designed to create strong reactions, using words like shock, crisis, or dramatic, while neutral language focuses on facts and uses terms like meeting, statement, or discussion. And recognizing this difference helps learners understand whether a report is trying to inform calmly or influence feelings.
For learners, one useful strategy is to listen for adjectives and adverbs, because these words often carry emotion. So if a report uses many strong descriptive words, it may be emphasizing drama rather than explanation. And by noticing this, learners can train themselves to separate emotional tone from factual information, which is an important part of media literacy.
The same diplomatic event can also be reported differently depending on the media outlet, the country, and the audience, because each organization chooses which details to highlight and which to place in the background. So one report may focus on the potential for peace, while another may emphasize risk or uncertainty. And this difference does not always mean one report is wrong, but rather that each is presenting a different angle.
This is why comparing multiple sources is helpful, because when learners read or listen to more than one report about the same event, they begin to notice patterns, repeated facts, and different interpretations, which builds confidence and reduces confusion, especially when dealing with international news that involves unfamiliar places or political systems.
Media literacy means understanding how news is produced, not just what it says, and for English learners this includes recognizing common headline vocabulary, such as talks, tensions, deal, pressure, or breakthrough, because these words appear frequently and often carry specific meanings that may not be obvious from direct translation alone.
To improve reading skills, learners can practice by rewriting headlines in their own words using simpler language, which helps confirm understanding and reduces emotional impact. And this exercise also strengthens vocabulary and paraphrasing skills, making it easier to engage with news content confidently.
Another useful tip is to pay attention to reporting verbs like said, claimed, confirmed, or denied, because these verbs indicate how certain the information is, and understanding them helps learners evaluate the reliability and intention of the report, which is especially important in political news, where statements and responses matter greatly.
For listening practice, it is helpful to focus on the first and last sentences of a news report, because these often summarize the main idea and provide context. And by training your ear to recognize these key points, you can follow longer discussions more easily without getting lost in details.
As we move forward, remember that media coverage shapes public understanding, but it does not control it completely, because learners who develop strong media literacy skills can read critically, listen carefully, and form their own understanding based on facts rather than emotions. And this ability is essential for engaging with global topics in a thoughtful and informed way.
By practicing these strategies and paying attention to language choices, you are not only improving your English, but also becoming a more confident and independent consumer of international news, which is exactly what we aim to support here on the English Globe, where learning English and understanding the world go hand in hand.
When we examine the idea of peace efforts, it is important to distinguish between short-term deals and long-term stability, because not every agreement that is announced publicly will create lasting peace. And in international relations, sustainable peace requires structures, processes, and trust that go beyond a single handshake, a newsworthy summit, or even a successful negotiation, which is why experts often look at treaties, institutions, and repeated cooperation as indicators of stability, rather than relying solely on the immediate results of high-profile diplomacy.
In simpler English, this means that one meeting or one signed document may create an agreement for today, but it does not always guarantee peace tomorrow, because relationships between countries depend on many factors, such as mutual trust, consistent communication, shared interests, and rules that guide behavior. And learners can practice future-focused language by thinking and speaking about what could happen next or what might support long-term peace.
Institutions and agreements play a major role in maintaining peace because they provide formal rules and predictable procedures for resolving disputes. And when countries rely on these structures, they reduce the risk that disagreements will escalate into conflict, which is why organizations like the United Nations, international courts, or multilateral treaties are frequently referenced in discussions about diplomacy, as they create a framework that ensures countries must follow agreed-upon standards even if leaders change or new tensions arise.
For learners, this teaches a useful conditional structure. If countries follow the agreements, then peace is more likely to last, or peace will continue if institutions are respected, which allows you to describe cause and effect situations about the future in clear English, while practicing complex but understandable sentences.
Another important factor for long-term stability is trust, which is built slowly over repeated interactions, reliable behavior, and transparency, because even the most carefully negotiated deal can fail if one country doubts the other's intentions, breaks agreements, or changes its position unexpectedly. And understanding this principle helps learners see that diplomacy is not only about agreements, but about relationships, credibility, and predictability over time.
Put simply, trust develops gradually, and without trust, even the best deals may not last. So learners can practice sentences like if trust is not built, then agreements may fail, or lasting peace depends on mutual confidence, which shows how conditional structures allow us to discuss future possibilities in English clearly and logically.
Personal diplomacy, which often includes direct meetings between leaders, can be very effective for initiating talks, creating attention, or resolving urgent problems, but it has limits when it comes to long-term stability, because it depends heavily on individual personalities, moods, and relationships, which can change over time, so relying solely on personal connections without supporting agreements, institutions, or broader cooperation may result in agreements that are fragile or short-lived.
In learner-friendly terms, this means that a deal that works because two leaders like each other may not survive if one leader leaves office or the relationship changes. So learners can practice future-focused sentences like if the leaders change, the agreement might not continue, which combines conditional thinking with predictions about the future.
Sustainable peace often requires a combination of both approaches. The energy and attention created by high-profile diplomacy, combined with the structure, trust, and rules provided by institutions and agreements, because short-term efforts can open doors, while long-term stability ensures that these doors remain open for years or decades. And this dual approach is why many analysts emphasize the importance of balancing personal diplomacy with formal frameworks in evaluating peace strategies.
Learners can simplify this by thinking, if high-profile diplomacy creates opportunities, and if institutions and trust support agreements, then peace can last longer, which is a clear conditional sentence that shows the relationship between short-term action and long-term results, and also helps learners describe cause and effect situations in English with confidence.
In summary, understanding peace efforts versus long-term stability requires future-focused thinking, because the value of any deal is not only measured by immediate headlines, but by whether it leads to predictable, peaceful interactions over time, and paying attention to how agreements, institutions, and trust function together helps learners interpret news, discussions, and analyses more accurately without overemphasizing dramatic short-term events.
By listening carefully and practicing these conditional sentences, learners improve both their understanding of international relations and their ability to express complex ideas about the future in English, because using clear structures like if, then, or peace will continue if helps you talk about possibilities, consequences, and planning in a logical, precise, and learner-friendly way. Exactly what we aim to support here on the English Globe.
As we near the end of today's discussion, it is important to connect everything we have explored about diplomacy, peace efforts, and global reactions to the practice of learning English, because one of the best ways to improve language skills is by engaging with meaningful, real-world topics. And in this episode, we have introduced key vocabulary such as diplomacy, negotiation, leverage, sanctions, tariffs, symbolism, trust, and institutions, all of which appear frequently in international news, political discussions, and academic contexts. And understanding these words allows learners not only to comprehend news stories, but also to discuss them confidently in English.
For learners, reviewing vocabulary in context is very helpful, because seeing words used in sentences, listening to explanations, and hearing how they connect to real events strengthens both comprehension and memory. So if you remember sentences like leaders use leverage to encourage negotiations, or trust is built through repeated interactions, you are practicing how to combine new vocabulary with sentence structures that are essential for advanced listening and speaking skills.
Another important benefit is improving listening skills, because long-form explanations like this podcast expose learners to complete sentences, cause and effect reasoning, conditional structures, and descriptive language, all of which are vital for understanding real-world English, especially when news reports or academic lectures use complex sentences, linking words such as while, because, if, then, or however, and phrases like face-to-face engagement, political messaging, and public perception, which help learners follow arguments logically.
To make this practical, learners can practice by pausing the podcast, repeating sentences slowly, and summarizing them in their own words. Because this encourages active listening, reinforces vocabulary, and helps learners think directly in English instead of translating from their native language, which is exactly what we aim for in long educational podcasts on the English globe.
Engaging with global topics also helps learners develop critical thinking in English, because understanding the reasons behind diplomatic decisions, international reactions, and media framing requires analysis, comparison, and interpretation. And discussing these issues in English allows learners to practice expressing complex ideas using neutral language, cause and effect structures, and descriptive phrases that are commonly used by journalists, educators, and professional speakers.
For learners, this means that exploring international news is not just about vocabulary, but about learning to think in English while analyzing information, noticing contrasts like support versus skepticism, short-term versus long-term outcomes, and emotional versus neutral language, and practicing these distinctions improves both comprehension and communication skills in real-life situations.
Another takeaway is noticing common language patterns used in political and news English, such as reporting verbs, conditional statements, and connectors, like therefore, meanwhile, in contrast, and as a result, because recognizing these patterns helps learners follow the logic of a story, understand relationships between events, and anticipate what may come next in a discussion or report.
Learners should also remember the importance of repeated exposure and practice, because listening to long podcasts, reading related articles, and trying to summarize or explain the content in English strengthens retention, improves fluency, and builds confidence, which is essential for anyone who wants to understand international topics while simultaneously developing language skills that are relevant, practical, and globally applicable.
In summary, today's topic has offered a combination of meaningful vocabulary, descriptive sentence structures, cause and effect reasoning, conditional language, and critical thinking, all of which are tools that learners can carry into their listening, reading, and speaking practice, because by engaging with real-world topics in English, learners not only understand the content better, but also internalize the language structures that make comprehension and communication smoother and more natural over time.
Finally, learners, keep practicing patiently, stay curious about global events, and remember that every sentence you understand, every new word you learn, and every idea you can explain in English strengthens your listening, vocabulary, and confidence, because language learning is most effective when it connects to meaningful topics that inspire thought, discussion, and real understanding. Exactly what we aim to provide here on the English globe, where English meets the world in a calm, structured, and enjoyable way.
As we come to the final part of today's episode, it is important to summarize the key ideas we have explored, and to remind our listeners that everything shared here is for educational purposes, because this podcast is designed to help English learners improve their listening, vocabulary, and comprehension skills while exploring meaningful global topics, not to provide political advice or influence opinions. Today, we discussed Donald Trump's approach to diplomacy, including his emphasis on direct negotiations, personal engagement, and the use of economic and political tools such as sanctions and tariffs, as well as how these strategies are interpreted differently by allies, rivals, and media outlets around the world.
In simpler terms, we have learned that diplomacy is complex, and that peace efforts involve both short-term deals and long-term stability, which depends on trust, institutions, and repeated cooperation. We also explored key vocabulary such as leverage, negotiation, symbolism, trust, institutions, and political messaging. And we showed how comparing international reactions, analyzing media coverage, and understanding tone and intention can help learners think critically while improving their English.
Another key point is that understanding global events requires careful attention to facts, neutral reporting, and balanced perspectives, because the same event can be described differently depending on culture, media outlet, or political context. By following the descriptions and examples we provided, learners can practice distinguishing between opinions and facts, emotional language versus neutral language, and short-term actions versus long-term outcomes, all of which are valuable skills for both language learning and global awareness.
For learners, this also reinforces the importance of listening carefully, reviewing key vocabulary, and practicing conditional and cause and effect sentences, because these structures help you discuss complex topics in clear, calm, and accurate English. Remember that understanding world events is a skill that grows with time, practice, and curiosity. So do not worry if some ideas seem difficult at first. Step by step, your listening and comprehension will improve.
We also want to make a clear and calm disclaimer for all our listeners. The content in this podcast is purely educational and intended for English learning purposes. It does not represent advice, endorsement, or judgment about any political figure, country, or policy. All examples, events, and terminology have been presented factually and neutrally to support language development, media literacy, and critical thinking skills.
As we close, we encourage all learners to continue exploring global topics, practicing new vocabulary, and thinking critically about news and discussions. Because combining English learning with curiosity about the world makes studying both meaningful and practical. Every sentence you understand and every word you practice brings you closer to becoming confident in English while being informed about international affairs.
In summary, today's episode offered a mix of language learning and global understanding, showing how diplomacy works, how leaders communicate, how countries respond, and how media shapes perception, all explained in a calm, neutral, and educational way. By practicing the vocabulary, sentence structures, and listening strategies presented today, learners can strengthen their English while also gaining insights into complex world events.
Finally, remember to keep learning, stay curious, and approach both English and global news with an open and thoughtful mind. Because consistent practice, careful observation, and curiosity will help you grow as a confident English learner and an informed global citizen. Exactly the goal of the English Globe.
Thank you for listening patiently, and we hope today's discussion has been both informative and helpful for your English learning journey. Keep practicing, keep exploring, and remember, understanding language and the world go hand in hand.
We look forward to having you with us in the next episode, and until then, stay motivated, stay curious, and continue using English to explore the world around you in a calm, structured, and enjoyable way.